Hello, everyone. Shana Tova to all of you who are joining us today for this very timely conversation. As Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has just landed in the US for his yearly address in the United Nations. At the same time, we hear reports of the talks between Israel, the US, and Saudi Arabia about normalizations. Um, while during the holiday, Saudi Arabia has announced that they halted the talks. The United States administration have already said this is inaccurate, so we all know that the conversation is still ongoing. We also celebrated this week the third-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, and hopefully we'll celebrate even more. In a more worrying aspect, there was a very worrying statement by the IAEA about Iran's nuclear enrichment. We saw that they are now at 18 times the level of enrichment agreed initially, and 3 times more than what the IAEA considers as from which can be considered as military enrichment. It's very worrying. And at the same time, also today, there was a prisoner exchange agreement between the United States and Iran, and $6 billion have been unlocked and have been going through to the Iranian regime. At the same time, we see that the IAEA have said that some countries are somewhat losing the importance and the touch regarding the importance of the Iranian nuclear enrichment. But at FELNET, we know that the Europeans have always had a strong stance, and we still work in order to promote Israel's stance on that. And that's why it's a very timely conversation that we have today, which will be moderated by our newly FELNET family member in the UK, Aaron Cohen-Gold, who's our Deputy Director in the UK. He's going to introduce our speaker and our topic. And it's worth mentioning that in the London office, we will host at the end of October the first E3 dialogue, which is very relevant to all of the updates that we're going to discuss today. And for further information, I'll let Aaron take it on from here and to a very interesting conversation today. Aaron, to you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a slight problem in that everyone can hear me, which is fantastic. I unfortunately can't hear anything because the speakers on my computer have just crashed, which is a real shame. While I work that out, forgive me for putting Daniel on the spot here, but Daniel, could you momentarily just take the reins just for a couple of minutes? Maybe if you could say a little bit about FELNET UK, and then of course hand over to Ofir to make his opening statement. And in the meantime, I will do my best to get my speakers back up and running ASAP. So apologies, but I'll be right back with you, hopefully, in a few moments.
No problem. So what we'll do, I'll just introduce our topic today, which is in our speaker, and I'll let Ofir introduce himself as well and say a few words. We are going to talk about the Israel relations with the Arab world in a very timely manner again. Ofir has been working up until very recently as Israel Prime Minister's spokesperson to the Arab world. And today we are celebrating this week a 3-year anniversary for the Abraham Accords. And obviously what we know that we know, and we know that we don't know, that Israel has been in conversation with several other Arab countries in the region, in the Middle East. And Ofir, to you.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Daniel and Aaron and Randy for my introduction and for inviting me to speak. It's a great opportunity. I think that the last time I did such a briefing was maybe 20 years ago when I served at the Israeli embassy in Canada. Usually all my briefings are done in Arabic, but since I suspect that your Arabic is a bit rusty, I'll indulge you and we'll do this in English. So I'd like to speak briefly about, a few issues that are relevant for the Israeli agenda these days. One of them is, of course, the possibility of normalization with Saudi Arabia. The other one is, of course, the third anniversary of the Abraham Accords. We'll speak a bit about the relations with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians are actually undergoing a significant change in their domestic arena. And we'll speak also about the possibility of, God forbid, a regional war that some Israeli officials have been warning us about. So let's start off with normalization. Now, you all know that there's been much talk about this. And this is something that has been in the pipes for quite some time. So now we have interests by the three parties involved: the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, in having an agreement. Of course, every party has its own agenda and interests here. It's a very complicated deal because, just a sec, please.
Maybe we just signed a deal.
Yeah, no. I just went to sign and to speak with the king, and I was back. So the Saudis, of course, want better relations with the Biden administration and the aftermath of the Khashoggi affair. Relations between Saudi Arabia and Washington have been strained for some time, 2 or 3 years. Now there's a chance to actually move forward past that. The Americans are desperately in need of a breakthrough in the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia seems like an interesting partner for that deal. And of course, there's Israel. Now, the Saudi preconditions for a deal are very, very difficult for Israel. They want 3 things. They want a nuclear capability. They want an American authorization to enrich uranium. For those of you who do not know, the only use for enriched uranium is to produce a bomb. There are no civilian uses for enriched uranium. This is why every time the Iranians would say we want a nuclear capability for energy, hence we want to enrich uranium for 20%, 60%, 94%, and so forth, everybody was laughing because the whole notion of having enriched uranium is to produce the fissile material for a bomb. And this is exactly what the Saudis want. They want to have their own bomb because they see the Iranians very, very close to producing an arsenal of nuclear weapons. And they want their own insurance policy. And that policy is military nuclear capability. So they are saying to the Americans, if you do not give us the enriched uranium, go ahead. We will go to the French, we'll go to the Chinese, we'll go to the Russians. In the Middle East, it's a known tactic. If you don't give me, I'll go to your competitor and he will give me a better price. This is the same thing. If they could have gotten it from the Russians, the Chinese, or the French, they would have gotten these centrifuges and equipment by now. They didn't because they want the American technology. And they also want a defense pact with the Americans. And that has, of course, direct bearing when it comes to Israel, because we are adamant that we will preserve our qualitative military edge in the region, which means that the weapons we get from the Americans have to be much better than those that are provided to other countries in the region. Now, although Israel does not, of course, support nuclear proliferation in the region, there have been some statements made by very high-ranking Israeli officials that Israel would be amenable to accept that, because if Israel does not agree to the Americans giving nuclear capability to Saudi Arabia, maybe the Saudis will go elsewhere. And there has been a very, let's say, lively debate inside Israel whether giving an Israeli approval for Saudi to have a military nuclear capability is a good thing or not. My opinion doesn't matter in this regard because I don't make those decisions, but I do have an opinion. So the Saudis also want significant Israeli concessions to the Palestinians. This proves very, very difficult because we have a very anti-Palestinian coalition. If you remember, just a few days ago, there was talk about handing over some armored vehicles to the Palestinians. This created a huge mess within the coalition. So imagine if Israel can't give the Palestinians 3 or 4 armored jeeps. What does it mean when the Americans are adamant that Israel would give political concessions to the Palestinians? This, of course, is very, very difficult. So you have a very complicated deal in which the Saudis have set a very high price. Israel cannot pay that price, but it still wants the end result, which is normalization. Will the Saudis become, let's say, more prone to lower the price? It remains to be seen. Is it possible that the Israeli Prime Minister will give something to the Saudis that will be sufficient for them and would be also acceptable to the coalition? That remains to be seen. Okay, so once you have so many difficult angles of that agreement, it is very, very difficult. Now, the agreement that we had with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco was devoid of these problems. So it was much easier to get an agreement with these countries. Therefore, we had the Abraham Accords. Now, if we do have an agreement with the Saudis, then the region absolutely changes. You know, I can say that once we do have an agreement with the Saudis, or there are diplomatic relations between Jerusalem and Riyadh, the Arab-Israeli conflict is over. Because other Arab countries will follow suit. Countries that are looking at Riyadh now for green light will get that green light, and the region will transform. But it doesn't mean that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will be over, because the Palestinians have no interest that it will be ever over. So if there is anything that the Palestinians can agree on, and I'm talking here about the PA and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so forth, they do not want to see Israel exist at all. They only differ about the ways to achieve it, okay? Some are for armed struggle, some are for diplomatic struggle, but ultimately, I've been in the business for over 30 years. I cannot see a single Palestinian leader saying Israel has a right to exist. We want to end the conflict, okay? This is out of the question. Abu Mazen is at the end of his 19th year of his 4 years term. There are not going to be any elections in the PA anytime soon, because according to all polls, Hamas is going to win. And Abu Mazen does not want to give the West Bank to Hamas after he lost the Gaza Strip to that Iranian-backed organization. So it's a very tricky time. Abu Mazen is 87, 88 years old. There is no number two. And, you know, we've seen some squabbling inside the Palestinian arena who will be the heir to the throne. We don't know who's going to be the successor. So some people are thinking about people who are close to the Americans, some who are perceived to be more pragmatic, but ultimately there is no natural leader. So my sense is that once Abu Mazen is gone, Hamas will try to take control over the West Bank as well, and therefore Israel will have to intervene, which means bloodshed. So what else? 3 years of the Abraham Accords. Now, you know, I've been to the UAE for the first time for the signing ceremony, and I can tell you that I couldn't believe my eyes. You know, we landed, and on top of the 50-degree weather and the 90% humidity, we couldn't believe the warmth in which we were received. Now, I was in other Arab countries before, Egypt and Jordan, and the welcome was always very cold. But it was very, very clear from the get-go that the Emiratis want a warm peace. Now, this was a novelty for us because we never experienced it. And, you know, it was such a profound change in the way that we looked at the region that it quickly became the model for us of how Israeli-Arab relations should look like. So the scope of the bilateral trade has risen to $3 billion this year, and it's going to reach $10 billion in about 2 or 3 years from now, which is huge. The UAE is going to be a very big trading partner for Israel. So hundreds of Israeli companies are flocking to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Deals are made every day, and the Emiratis are really, really forthcoming. So once other countries in the region have seen the scope of trade between the two countries, they want a piece of the pie. So we have seen Egypt and Jordan jumping on the bandwagon in order to, you know, get their own profits from those relations. Now, both Jordan and Egypt are facing a huge economic crisis for years, and dealing with Israel economically, trading with Israel seems to be a good way for them to move forward, to get out of that, economic quagmire. So more and more Jordanians are working in Israel, especially in Eilat, and Israel is selling more and more natural gas to Egypt. And the very cold shoulder that we used to get from the Jordanians and Egyptians when it comes to trade, this has diminished a bit. So that's a good thing. In Bahrain and Morocco, of course, there are trade relations and so forth, but very, very low compared to those that we have with the UAE. Because bear in mind that you have opposition to the Abraham Accords in both Bahrain and Morocco still. So that remains a bit of a tricky issue, but I think we're on the right track. When it comes to the Palestinians, we just, I don't know if celebrated is the right word, but we noted the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. Now, there was a lot of debate in Israel whether these agreements were positive or negative with regard to Israeli interests. Well, I think that, if you take the pros and the cons, I think that the agreements were very bad for Israel. It's true that they have brought us peace with Jordan, and they were probably, the bedrock of the Abraham Accords. But ultimately, did we gain peace from the Oslo Accords? The answer is no. Hamas became very, very strong. Iran is now inside the territories, not only in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. We've seen quite a few attempts by the Iranians to smuggle Claymore mines into Israel. And we didn't get what we were hoping for. We thought, and I remember this well, because I was in the military at the time, we thought that the Oslo Accords would be a Palestinian version of the Camp David Accord with Egypt. This is the model that we had at the time. So we thought that once we signed the agreements, the conflict will be over, there will be trade. I remember that people even spoke about opening an Israeli consulate in Ramallah and a Palestinian embassy in East Jerusalem. Now, this sounds ridiculous today, but this was the thinking at the time, because this is what we had with the Egyptians. We had an embassy in Cairo and a consulate in Alexandria, and we really thought that the conflict would be over. We were mistaken. So after 30 years, we are no closer to peace with the Palestinians, and I maintain that as long as it's up to the Palestinians, we will never have peace, because the conflict is a core component of their identity. Without conflict, there is no Palestinian identity at all. Because they're a mirror image of Zionism, the reverse image of Zionism. The Palestinian National Movement was created as a response to the rise of Zionism. And if you ask Palestinians on the street, and if you read polls, what do they want? They want to free Palestine from the river to the sea. That means no Israel. And that's consensus. It doesn't matter if they are supporters of Fatah or Hamas or PFLP or Islamic Jihad. It's a consensus. Nobody thinks that we have a right to live in this country. That's a problem, but we will have to deal with it, because ultimately we're not going anywhere. So just a few comments about the possibility of regional war. Are we closer to regional war now than we were a year ago? Absolutely. Absolutely. Hezbollah and Hamas are looking at Israel, and they're seeing a weaker Israel. They think that Israel is the weakest that it has ever been. They see all those pilots, all those reserve officers, all those special forces reservists that say that they will not report for duty, and in their mind, that's a recipe for collapse, for military collapse. Now, if we would look at if this would have happened in Iran, and the Air Force of the Revolutionary Guard would we would see hundreds of pilots saying that they will not fly for the Islamic republic, if we will see Iranian special forces saying that they will not fight, you will say that the regime is going to collapse. And this is exactly how they're looking at Israel. Do I think that if war erupts, those people will not run to their squadrons and tanks and so forth? No, they will run to their squadrons and tanks and so forth. But I cannot, I have to tell you that I do think that Israel is the weakest that it has ever been. Therefore, the chance of war is going up. So people are saying, okay, but they do know that if they attack Israel, Lebanon will be flattened and the Lebanese would suffer thousands of casualties and so forth. But, this is a Western way of looking at things. I think we should look at it from a Shiite point of view, from Hezbollah point of view. And the whole raison d'etre of Hezbollah is to destroy Israel and to liberate Palestine. So if they think that the time is right, if they think that Israel is the weakest that it had ever been, maybe the price for them to attack Israel, even if they are suffering hundreds and thousands of casualties and destroying, the southern part of Lebanon, is an acceptable price if they get what they want, which is the destruction of Israel. And I maintain that they do think that the price is acceptable. They don't care about the thousands of people being killed, and they certainly don't care about the destruction of Lebanon. Because Lebanon is in shambles today, and they don't care. Okay, so they probably think that the Israeli bee has lost its sting. Maybe that sting is not sharp anymore, and they can take their chances. And we have seen people from the military, the chief of staff, the head of military intelligence say time and time again that the chances of regional war are rising. If there's war with Hezbollah, naturally the Gaza Strip will join, and we'll see other fronts going into action as well. That is going to be a huge, huge challenge. We do have, of course, air defenses and missile defense and so forth. But imagine that Hezbollah has more rockets than any other Arab army. They have 150, 160,000 rockets. So they can maintain a fire tempo of 1,500, 1,600 rockets a day. And sure, we can shoot down quite a few of those, but for how long? For how long? So imagine, these, fields of fire, these barrages of rockets, 1,500, 1,600 every day for weeks on end. That's going to be a challenge.
Ofir, if I may, forgive me, because this is it's a dark note on which to interject. But I'm conscious of the clock, so I just wonder if, having gone through some of those really helpful background points, firstly, if I can thank you for that, and also thank you both to you, to Daniel, and to everyone for bearing with me for my struggle with technology earlier on, but we have overcome those struggles. I thought what I might quickly do now is just ask you maybe a quick couple of questions, and then we'll allow maybe half an hour, 25 minutes worth of time for guests to put forward any questions that they have. Just before I do ask you a couple of questions, just to reiterate what's already been put in the chat, please do, if anyone has any questions, please do put those questions into the chat function. And then my colleagues will direct me to those questions. And so we'll be able to get around as many of you as possible. So, Ofir, you've gone through some of the background there in great detail. Some of it optimistic, some of it a bit less optimistic. Going back to the initial area that we started on, which was around the sort of Saudi Arabia question in particular. I'm conscious, as Daniel said, that there's a lot of rumors in the air at the moment around the Saudis backing out or the Saudis not backing out of these negotiations. One thing I wanted to ask you, just really to help our guests get a sense of where Saudi Arabia are coming from when it comes to these negotiations. It's widely been assumed that the Saudis gave tacit agreement to the UAE and to Bahrain to sign the Abraham Accords 2-3 years ago, which, of course, have just celebrated that anniversary. Is that the case, in your opinion? And therefore, is it a logical next step for the Saudis to join? or was the Emirati and Bahraini decisions completely independent of Saudi involvement?
You know, it's a bit tricky because the UAE and Bahrain are not the same, and the relations with Saudi are quite different. Now, Bahrain has been always very, very close to Saudi Arabia, while the UAE has been much more independent. But did they speak with the Saudis about having relations with Israel? I think so. I don't know, but I would imagine that they did. And if the Saudis were adamant against it, maybe things would have been different. So I do think that they got a green light from the Saudis. But you know what? It doesn't really matter because ultimately, you know, these are two independent players with their own interests and with their own calculations. And you know, I've seen the pictures from the recent visit by the Israeli Foreign Minister to Manama. And, you know, I've been following Bahraini media. You know, if they wanted to have a low-profile visit, they know how to do it, but it was a very high-profile visit. You know, they were after the, you know, things that happened before with Libya and so forth. So they do have an interest in having good relations with Israel. They have a lot of, you know, reasons why. Security-wise, Iran is on the other side of the Gulf. Technology-wise, they want Israeli technology and so forth. But I do think that the Saudis are next. I also think that one shouldn't take seriously every report that comes up in Arab media.
There are many of those. And actually, just on that reporting, a lot has been made of America's role in this current bilateral or multilateral negotiation that's currently taking place. So I wanted to ask you, with all your experience, how much of this rapprochement at the moment is being driven by America's desire to bring Saudi Arabia back into its orbit after some frosty years of relationships between the administrations in Washington and in Riyadh? And does that even matter? Should that matter to Israel if that is the case, that it's being driven by geopolitics, or is that just a useful bit of background to help oil the deal, so to speak?
Look, we as Israelis look on our side of the deal for the price that we have to pay and the gains that we want to get. I think that the Americans very much want the Saudis to join the Abraham Accords, and they do want, you know, start over with MBS because they think that he's a very powerful player in Saudi and probably the next king. So it doesn't really make much sense in, you know, prolonging the you know, cold atmosphere between Washington and Riyadh. The problem is the price. So if we do agree to that price, maybe, you know, we will get the deal now, but there will be repercussions later because ultimately, you know, we know that things are, you know, might change in the region. Okay, so it's a difficult deal to digest. So some Israelis look at the end result and they don't care about the price, and some care more about the price than the end result.
Sure.
So, yes, please.
I mean, you've alluded to some of those potential prices, particularly around the question of nuclear enrichment. Yeah. Another thing that's often been talked about, I know you said we shouldn't take media reporting too literally, but I know it has been very, very widely mentioned from some quite trusted sources. But one of the other things that the Saudis are interested in is, I suppose you'd call it high quality, sort of technologically extremely advanced weaponry, particularly when it comes to advanced aircraft. One of the key pillars of Israel and indeed America's foreign policy for many years has been the question of qualitative military edge, to ensure that Israel always has military superiority to ensure its survival in a region that has historically been very hostile to it. So if the Saudi demand is, on the one hand, nuclear enrichment, but on the other hand, also really advanced weaponry that might potentially erode in the long run Israel's QME, as it's called, its qualitative military edge. Mm-hmm. Should we be worried about that, in your opinion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Because, you know, now we have, you know, a positive figure in Saudi, but what can happen in 5, 10 years, 15 years time? So
exactly.
They will have the F-35s, and they will have a military nuclear program. What happens if, Saudi Arabia has changed, looking back 20 years ago, it was the bastion of Wahhabism, which isn't a very, let's say,
Israel friendly.
Yeah, to say the least. So, who knows what might happen? And we've seen it many times before in other countries that we have relationship with. So that's a lot to take in. And that's a difficult decision, whether the price is worth it. And it seems from things that are coming from the Prime Minister's circle that he thinks that the price is worth it. But, it remains to be seen what will be decided.
Indeed, and I'm sure there are some that would rather see compromise in some level towards Palestinians at a more satisfactory, less higher price than potentially eroding QME or potentially facilitating nuclear proliferation in the region. So it's going to be extremely interesting to see how this irons out. Just one final question before we open it up to members of the audience. At last week's G20, we saw one of the flagship announcements was the launch of the Indian, Middle East, Mediterranean Economic Corridor, a bit of a mouthful. So they've given it the acronym of IMEC. But IMEC would link Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE together via a railway, along with fiber optic cables, green hydrogen pipelines, a number of other things. Would this deal, in your view, be possible without the prospect of Israel-Saudi normalization?
Yes, absolutely.
It would be.
Yes,
okay.
Because we tend to look at things as binary, whether they are going forward or not, 1 or 0. And it's not the case at all in the Middle East. We've been flying over Saudi airspace on our way to the UAE and Bahrain. We didn't give anything in return. And ultimately, the Palestinians have lost their grip over Arab-Israeli relations. So it doesn't mean that the Saudis do not want to give the Palestinians something in return, but we shouldn't think that if we do not give everything, we wouldn't get anything. It's not the case at all. And bear in mind that Haifa is on the edge of that railroad or project or whatever. So without the Haifa port, there is no export to Europe. There is no other port in the region. They cannot go to Beirut. They cannot go to Tartus or Latakia in Syria. They have to have Haifa. That means that with whatever happens with the Palestinians, this project will come through because there is no other way. There is no other port that could be used in order to export goods from India via the UAE and Saudi to Europe. Okay, so I think that the project will be absolutely operational, even if we do not have a breakthrough with the Palestinians. Now, maybe the Israeli government will give the Palestinians some economic incentives and so forth, but I don't think we will go all the way. And on top of that, we don't have to pay full price, right? We don't have to agree to everything that the Saudis are demanding. We can agree to certain things. We can have some caveats and so forth. So it's not do or die. It's not if you have to pay everything in order to get something. I think there is an interim road that could be pursued.
Okay, well that's really helpful. Just while we're waiting for more questions into the pipeline, and I'd just like to remind everyone how to submit questions. If you just click on the chat function in the bottom of your screen, you'll then have a to section. You'll be able to type a message. If you put as the to FELNET Q&A, please direct your questions to FELNET Q&A in the chat function, and then we'll be able to see your questions. Just while we wait for a couple more to filter in, I think Daniel may have mentioned earlier while I was having sound problems that FELNET UK will be hosting in London the E3 dialogue involving various different representatives from the UK, from France, Germany, as well, of course, as from Israel. So I thought it'd be interesting to ask you what role you think Europeans, and I'm proud to say that the UK should be counted among that, what role, in your view, should Europeans and indeed European governments be playing either in promoting normalization or, since you also mentioned it, dealing with the Iranian threat, not just to normalization, but more broadly across the Middle East? Quite a juicy question to throw at you there.
So when it comes to normalization, I think you should speak about those countries who haven't joined in the club. And I will go for Tunisia. I will go for Algeria, countries that are vehemently anti-Israel. I think you should speak with other countries in the Arabian Peninsula, such as Qatar, a very important country, though small, and try to, understand, what might bring them in. Why? There is no sense in, I think, in speaking with, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, because they're already on board. But, ultimately, there are people in all those countries who think that, the era of boycotting Israel has ended. And there's nothing to gain from boycotting Israel. And, if I could speak with Tunisian ambassador in the UK, I would raise that question, what have you gained? What have you gained from calling death to Israel and so forth? You're not a threat to Israel, you're too far away. You haven't aided the Palestinians at all. What have you gained from your policy of, 70 some years? Maybe you can look at the region in different eyes. Maybe you have other interests. Maybe Israel can help. Just learn from others' positive experience in the region. And that's one. When it comes to Iran, this is the big question. It seems that the Americans are interested in rapprochement. They're not interested in logging heads with the Iranians. Just today, as you mentioned, we've seen the Iranian hostage diplomacy bearing fruit. 5 abductees, hostages, they got $6 billion in return. So the price of every hostage goes up and up and up. And who knows what will be the price for the next hostages, because Iran will kidnap other people because it gets money.
Yeah.
And the Iranians have no incentive of stopping it. So, I can't understand from an Israeli point of view, why does the UK have an Iranian embassy in London? Why the French have an embassy in Paris and so forth? So, of course, they will say because we need to speak with them anyway, but, this is not a normal country.
This is a very live, you tap there into a very live discussion we're having on a semi-frequent basis at the moment when it comes to prescription of the IRGC, among many other issues that we're working with our colleagues in the British government on. That was really helpful, and I look forward to raising some of those challenges with our friends from Tunisia when I get the chance.